There was once a king, and when his wife, the queen, died, he took comfort in the arms of a serving maid, Annie. Now, she wasn't like any of the courtesans at court. She was plump, she was cuddly, she was sensible, she was nice. And for the first time in his long life, the king actually felt happy, and he felt loved. And his joy was complete when Annie presented him with twins, a boy, Julian, and a girl, Juliet. Well, the king wanted to do the honest thing and marry this woman. But his advisor said, "Oh, your majesty, you can't marry her. Her father is a farmer. You'll lose respect in this country and in all the adjoining countries. Nobody will respect you or listen to you ever again." The king was crestfallen because he liked Annie. But he was also worried that if the children were brought up at court, they could well get bullied, because although they were the king's children, they were also a farmer's grandchildren. There were plenty of bastards at court. I mean, goodness knows, everybody was always having affairs with somebody. But this was awkward. And so he did the best thing he could. He gifted Annie a castle, scarcely 2 days' ride away from the palace, dead easy to get to. And he gave her a small but adequate pension. And he said that she may take 2 friends with her from court, so when she moved into the castle, she wouldn't feel lost and alone with people she didn't know and strange servants. Well, Annie immediately chose her best friend, who was Jane, the under housekeeper. And then, much to everybody's surprise, the king's steward, Sir Thomas, asked if he could join the company. He said, "I have served this king all his life. I have served his father, and I'm tired, I'm old. The thought of a small castle in the country really appeals." Well, it would, wouldn't it? And he thought, "I can then look after Annie and the children if you, your majesty, can't be there." Now, Annie was delighted because she liked the steward. He was one of the few people who had felt that maybe the king being with Annie was a good idea. And the king thought, if I can't be there to look after my family, then I trust nobody more than good Sir Thomas. And so the move was made. The castle was comfortable and well repaired. It was warm, and Annie was elevated to Lady Anne. And in the country air, the children grew like weeds. The king came as often as he could to see his lovely, adored little family. But he was getting old and coming less and less. And Sir Thomas, the steward, thought it was time that maybe Annie met some of her neighbours. Now, in the nearby castle, there was a duke and a duchess. But they were snobs. They had a vast castle and huge estates, and they were the king's close relatives. And Sir Thomas thought they'd be ideal, but they are snobs. So one day he rode over and he spoke to the Duke and Duchess. They knew him well because he was highly respected at court, and he explained that he would like to introduce the Lady Anne and the twins to them. "Oh, no," they said. "Well, I mean, she's a serving maid, isn't she?" "Yes," said Sir Thomas, "but the children are the king's blood, and he has acknowledged them." Not sure. I mean, it's a bit beneath our dignity, isn't it?" And then Sir Thomas said, "But the king is getting old and weak. It would please him greatly if there was somebody of your status and your wisdom to be unofficial godparents to the baby." At this, the Duke and Duchess thought, well, if it's going to put us in better standing with the king, maybe it's not such a bad idea. And so they invited the Lady Anne and the children over. Well, the day went remarkably well. They liked Anne because not only had she got common sense and warmth and humour, she wasn't clever in that nasty, edgy way. She was never unkind or sarcastic. But best of all, the Duke and Duchess had a little boy, Hugo, and he adored the twins. They were pretty well the same age. Now, up until then, Hugo had been really unhappy. He had an older brother, Victor, who was already a teenager, and he enjoyed his weapons lessons. He enjoyed training to be a young duke. He enjoyed land management. He enjoyed accountancy, for crying out loud. He would be the perfect duke. But of course, Hugo was the spare to the heir and didn't really have a place. The Duke and Duchess, being snobs, wouldn't let him play with any of the palace children, and so he ran riot or sat miserably with his nanny in the nursery. But meeting Julian and Juliet gave him a new lease of life. He was over the moon. He was so happy. Well, the Duke and Duchess soon discovered that it was very good being friends with Annie and Sir Thomas, because when the king came down to visit the children, the Duke and Duchess were invited to dine. This suited their outlook on life, and they were more than happy. And soon Hugo was spending more time with Annie and the twins than he was in his own castle. He learned to tilt at a quintain. He lifted his first broadsword there, and Juliet had a go too. She wasn't going to be left behind. Her sword was a little smaller, but she could wield it with deadly effect. You didn't mess with Juliet. The children did lessons together. They learned to ride together. They went hunting in the woods together. And soon these young saplings grew into young trees. And anybody who had eyes or had a heart could soon tell that Hugo and Julian were a little more than just friends. Now, in those days, it was impossible for two men to get married, but it was very acceptable for two young knights to go knight-erranting together, on adventures, to right wrongs, to fight for justice, as brother knights across the land. And so that's what they planned to do. They would go adventuring when they were old enough. But first they would have to be knighted. But one day sad news came. The king, their father, had died, and the crown prince had taken their place. He sent for Sir Thomas and said, "What is the Lady Anne like? How are the children growing?" And Sir Thomas said, "The Lady Anne never gossips about her time with the king. The Lady Anne is discreet and works hard. The children are good, and they have no ideas above their station. In other words, they haven't got their eye on your throne, your majesty." And so the new king, King Adam, was content with this and left them in peace. But one day, about 4 or 5 years later, when the young lads were about 18, King Adam sent for his half-brother and his friend Hugo. For there was war in the land. The southern borders were being invaded. Now the king had heard this news, and he had to get an army together quickly, and he needed young blood, new knights, new captains for his army. Who was he going to choose? All the young men came to show off their weapons skills. Hugo and Julian were foremost amongst them in their brightly polished armour. They were determined to please the king. They fought well. They showed off their skills in the lists, in archery, in hunting, in wrestling, in broadsword fighting. And the king was delighted that when the day came to knight all the new young men, that Hugo and Julian were knighted first. King Adam was very, very impressed with these young men. But that very same day, a letter came from Hugo's father, the Duke, to say that Victor, Hugo's older brother, had been thrown from his horse and had broken his neck and had died. Hugo took the letter to the king and said, "Your Majesty, my father begs to be forgiven my service at your side. He has sent you gold towards the expenses of your army, and my father begs you, allow me to come home, for he is old and is feeling very bereft. He needs me at his side to help run his estates." The king was sorry to see a knight as valiant as Hugo leave, but he was also very pleased to receive the gold. So he was forgiven service. And that night, the night before they were to leave, Hugo and Julian lay in each other's arms and swore undying love and faithfulness. And in the morning, Hugo rode home, and Julian, now a captain, rode behind his half-brother, the king. Well, in the first days of the war, it went very, very badly. The army, which was trying to take over the land, had been planning this for years. They had sent spies. They knew how the land was. They knew the good places to hide. They knew where to ambush. They knew where to place their troops. They knew where the crops and the fat cattle were to feed their army. But of course, King Adam and his army, although it was his land, he was taken completely by surprise. It looked, in the first few weeks of the fighting, as if King Adam might actually lose his whole land. And then one day, the king, feeling very sad and uncertain, climbed a hill, partly to be alone, but partly to look at the lie of the land, to see if he'd missed a trick. Was there somewhere down there that he'd missed that he could use to his advantage? But as he looked across the troops, his own and the rebel king's, 3 men crept out from the bushes. They drew their swords, came very quietly, and pounced on the king and wounded him. But Sir Julian, who had followed his half-brother at a distance to make sure he was safe, also drew his sword and within moments had the chief assailant dead at his feet. The other 2 men looked up, squeaked like mice, and ran. Julian was confused they had not stayed to fight, but he took the helmet of the dead man and saw it was the king of the invading army. Drawing his sword, he sliced the head off, and carrying the gory trophy down the hill, with King Adam, wounded but still all right, at his side, they gave the head to the herald, who impaled it on a spear, mounted his horse and rode towards the enemy lines, their king's head dripping and gory and foul. At this, the invading army turned and fled. The battle was over. The war was won. King Adam left several cohorts of soldiers along the southern borders to secure it and to put all to rights and heal the wounds of the war. Then he rode back to his palace with Sir Julian at his side. A few days later, King Adam ordered a victory feast. And, as a good king should, he was giving favours to all who had served him well in the battle. And when the herald called Julian's name, the young man came and knelt before his half-brother. But King Adam raised him up, kissed him on both cheeks, and placed a small golden crown on his head. And to all assembled he said, "Up until today this young man was called Julian Fitzroy, the bastard son of the king. But from today he shall be called Prince Julian. I proclaim him my full blood brother, for he not only saved my life, but the whole kingdom." And of course everybody cheered, "Yay, Julian, Julian," because he was really liked. The following day, Julian asked his brother if he may have permission to go home and tell his mother and his sister that all was well. The king would have plucked the moon out of the sky for Julian. He gave him gold and jewels for his sister and mother and silk dresses. And Julian sent a messenger ahead And 2 days later, he arrived home to cheers and laughter and a banquet. And of course, Hugo was there. At the feast, Julian ate and drank and stood and told everybody the tale of the battle. And most of all, what everybody wanted to hear 5 or 6 times, he could never tell it enough, was how he had saved the king and turned the tide of the war. When the feast was over and people started to depart, Julian and Hugo retired to Julian's room. There they held hands and talked quietly, sipping wine. Julian said, "My beloved, you are sad." And Hugo said, "I have bad news for you. Are your mother and father well? They were here at the banquet. What's wrong?" And Hugo said, "My beloved, I have been commanded to marry." "Ah. But why commanded?" asked Julian. Hugo hung his head and said, "My father knows that I am disinclined to marry a lady of my own free will. And so he has commanded that I make this alliance. And now I have the choice of obeying him and betraying you, or just walking away. But I love my father and my mother, and I don't want to leave the kingdom. I belong here. This is my home. I love the lands my father has cared for so many years." And Julian held his sweetheart's hand and said, "One day maybe the king will command me to marry as well for some political reason. You and I both know what our love means to each other, and we both know that marriage is unavoidable. We must do our duty, both of us, but we shall always know that we love each other unfailingly." A few days later, an invitation came from the Duke and the Duchess, requesting that Prince Julian, Princess Juliet, Lady Anne, and the steward Sir Thomas, who Lady Anne had now married since the king's death, should attend as guests of honour at the betrothal feast for Hugo, their son, and the Lady Carlotta, the daughter of a foreign nobleman of a country with a completely unpronounceable name. It was an excellent alliance. On the given evening, Julian and Sir Thomas escorted the ladies into the great hall. They met the Duke and Duchess, who curtsied and bowed before the Prince and Princess, and escorted them to the high table. The young people were allowed to sit together at one end and the older people at the other. The feast was magnificent. Hugo introduced the Lady Carlotta to Julian. Now she was as black as the night sky. Her eyes shone like stars, and her smile was like the moon. She was beautiful. She was kind, she was gentle, she was courteous. And Sir Thomas watched the young people. He guessed, quite rightly, that Julian and Hugo were in fact holding hands under the linen cloth. But what intrigued him was the way Carlotta and Juliet sat, fingers touching, eyes full of stars. They were like sisters who adored each other, or long-lost friends. Could there be more? Now, Sir Thomas was a wise old bird. He excused himself from the company of the older people and asked if he may be permitted to sit with the young people. They were honoured to have him, for they trusted and loved the old man. And he sat and he said, "My friends, I am going to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer as you would answer before the Lord God on the day of judgment, not as you would answer a king or somebody for whom you must give the correct answer. Do you swear that you will speak the truth to me?" Julian and Juliet and Hugo immediately swore, but Carlotta looked worried. And Julian leaned across and said, "My lady, I trust this man with my life. You also may trust him." "I have friends none when father gone," she said. "I may trust you?" "You may," said Sir Thomas. "Will you only speak the truth to me?" "I swear." "Good." Sir Thomas leaned over to Hugo and Carlotta and said, "My lord, my lady, before God, do you wish this marriage?" Hugo looked into Carlotta's face and said, "You, madam, apart from my sister Juliet, are the most beautiful and kind and generous lady. I would be honoured to have you at my side, but before God, no, I do not wish for this marriage." And Carlotta looked at him nervously, and then she gave a slight smile to Juliet and said, "I too no wish marry, but Hugo Goodman, I honour him." "Good," said Sir Thomas. And then he turned to Julian and said, "My lord, would you consider taking the Lady Carlotta as your wife, if you had to marry?" And Julian said, "Well, one day I will have to marry, and I would be honoured to have the Lady Carlotta, but I would not wish to insult my friend Hugo." Hugo said, "It's no insult. Any man would be proud to have a lady like this at his side." And then Sir Thomas said, "Carlotta, if you had to marry, would you marry Prince Julian?" "I honoured," she said. And then Sir Thomas turned to Juliet and to Hugo and said, "What about you two? You've both got to get married one day. Would you contemplate marrying each other?" They both burst out laughing. Nobody else could put up with this, they said. Juliet looked at Hugo and says, "He knows what I'm like." And Hugo said, "Yeah, and I know what you're like. I think if I had to marry, I think you and I would be the perfect match." "Excellent," said Sir Thomas. "Now, may I have permission to speak to your fathers on your behalf?" "Yes." They were a little bit confused, but Julian and Juliet were beginning to get Sir Thomas's drift. And so the old man made his way slowly down to the other end of the table, and he sat between the Duke and Carlotta's father and said, "My lords, I have served the king as his chief steward for many years, and his father, and I have been party to several royal betrothals, and I do know a bit about royal marriages, how they work. And I have an idea how to rearrange this wedding so that both of you will have very, very advantageous matches." The Duke looked a little bemused and Carlotta's father blinked, but the Duchess said, "We trust this gentleman. Listen to him." "Well, speak on," said the Duke. What are you thinking, old chap?" And Sir Thomas said, "If your Hugo were not to marry Carlotta, but were to marry the Lady Juliet, he would be marrying the king's sister." At this, Carlotta's father looked perturbed. "Carlotta not good enough?" "Ah," said Sir Thomas, "Carlotta, I would suggest, would marry Prince Julian. And so each young person would be marrying the king's brother and sister. Each wedding is more advantageous than the original match. And I think the young people would get on perfectly well." The Duke and Carlotta's father put their heads together and whispered. And then a few minutes later said, "Yes, it is decided. We agree. We will announce it." But Sir Thomas said, "Now that Julian and Juliet are the king's full brother and sister, we need to ask permission. But I think I can put it to him in a way that he will agree." A few weeks later, the king's permission was granted. His wound still ached him. He could not attend the wedding, but he gave gold towards the expenses and many barrels of excellent red wine. Not long after, the invitations were issued to the double wedding of Prince Julian and Lady Carlotta, and of Princess Juliet and Sir Hugo. The king also sent silk for the ladies' dresses and jewels. There was a big kerfuffle, everything getting ready. But on the morning of the wedding, Juliet and Carlotta sat in their room, giggling and helping each other with jewellery, while the maids tried in vain to fix the ladies' hair and arrange their silk veils. The gentlemen were ready fairly quickly, and so they strode through Julian's castle, and they made sure the tables were laid and the dishes were already on the table, and jugs of the king's good wine. And the acrobats were stretching and the singers were warming their voices, and at the far end of the hall some actors were putting up a stage to perform a play. This was going to be a magnificent feast. The midday bell rang, and the ladies were escorted by Sir Thomas down to the chapel steps, and there they met their husbands-to-be. But they paused at the chapel door, and Sir Thomas said, "My young friends, I have some sad news. Your dear friend, the family priest, Father Edward, has been taken ill, but he has sent a suitable replacement, who I'm sure will do the wedding perfectly." Now Juliet and Hugo and Carlotta and Julian were very sad because they didn't like to lie before God. And Father Edward knew the secrets and the truth in their hearts. And if they were going to take vows, they would rather do it before a priest who understood and would treat them with love and compassion. But things were as they were. Julian took Carlotta's arm and Hugo took Juliet's, and they entered the chapel, and everybody rose to their feet. There were the great and the good, the nobles, the knights. There was even some very, very famous dignitaries from other lands. It was a magnificent spectacle. They came to the front of the chapel, and the priest came out, a tall, imposing-looking man. His gown was a little short, which seemed odd. He was broad-chested, and he had a deep rolling voice that filled the chapel with the sound of spoken wine. It was a magnificent voice, the sort of voice that thrilled you to hear it. And he spoke the words of the service. The vows were exchanged, the blessings given. The choir sang and the bells rang out. And both couples walked out of the chapel and led the rejoicing party into the hall. Well, the tables were groaning with wild boar and roast swan and sweetmeats and wine and mead and honeycomb and grapes. It was the most wonderful feast. After they'd eaten, the trestles were cleared away. The acrobats did their displays, the singers sang. And then there was dancing, more drinking, more singing. And then when everybody was tired, they sat down to watch the actors. They performed a play about two couples who almost, but not quite, married the wrong people. It was an excellent play, and the lead actor was a tall, imposing-looking man, barrel-chested under the beautiful velvet wine-like voice. But most people were too drunk to notice or to care. There was more drinking, more dancing, and then the filthy songs began, the ribald jokes, the floor-stamping, the stomp, 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 time to get on with it, boys. And Sir Thomas escorted the young people out and into the hallway to, "Hooray! Get on with it, lads! Tell us about it tomorrow! Yay!" And in the quiet of the hall, Sir Thomas said to the young people, "Friends, do not go to bed tonight. Wait up, because there is one more celebration for this wonderful day. Stay awake." So each couple went to their rooms and sat with a supper and wine, talking quietly by the fire, until Sir Thomas deemed that the whole castle was either asleep or dead drunk. It was quiet. The matins bell rang. Silence. The moon looked down and filled the courtyard with silver light. Sir Thomas went up to the rooms. "Come with me, friends. Come down to the courtyard. Come to the chapel steps." They met there in the dark, bathed in silver light. Sir Thomas opened the chapel door. It was quiet. There were 2 candles on the altar. The air smelled of honey, beeswax, and incense. And there was a lone figure by the altar. Both young couples walked forward, confused and a little, not quite sure what was happening. And Father Edward came into the light and said, "Friends, I hope you will forgive my little lie earlier. I have said confession and I have done my penance. Now, I think it's time you were married properly, don't you?" And he took Julian's hand and placed it in Hugo's, and Juliet's and placed it in Carlotta's. The wedding was read. The vows were exchanged. Heart was joined to heart. The blessings were given, and both couples retired to their rooms. Now, in following weeks, Juliet and Hugo spent a lot of time with Julian and Carlotta, sometimes at one castle, sometimes at another. But after about a year, the men said that they had heard that there was a king in another country, someone called Arthur, who needed knights for a quest, something to do with the Holy Grail. And they had been asked if they could come and give a year of their valuable lives to serve Arthur in this holy cause. Did the ladies mind? "Oh no," they said. "We have been worried that none of us have been blessed with children, and so we thought we would make a pilgrimage to Rome to pray at the tomb of St. Peter." Hugo and Julian went one way, and Carlotta and Juliet went to Rome. When both couples met up about a year or 13, 14 months later, they had many stories to tell. But best of all, Carlotta gave Julian a beautiful son. He was the colour of ripe figs and just as sweet. And Juliet presented Hugo with twins, with his fair hair and her blue eyes. The girls blushed and said, although we had gone to pray for children, we both discovered when we got there we were pregnant, and the doctor said it was not wise to travel in our condition. And so, here are your children, beloveds. Meanwhile in Rome, the nuns who had found the orphans counted their gold very carefully. And they were God-fearing women. They would make very sure the money went to help the poor and the needy. But the women had a joy deep in their hearts, for they knew they had found good homes for all 3 children, and they would be loved and looked after. And I have done endless research in ancient manuscripts, and from what I can discover, they all lived happily ever after.